Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Steve Hayes and this is Michael Darby, and we're both technical directors at Element. Thanks for joining us again on one of our regular industry updates of all the things that are happening, changing, newsworthy in the radio, electrical and compliance world. We're doing this the back end of the summer. Summer's been poor for most of Europe, so people like Michael and I, who are sort of UK based, typically go away. One of us did and caught some sun. The other one stayed inside, did they?
One of us looks like we've been out in the sun the whole time. The other one looks like he's been stuck inside working all the time. I have had a holiday. I think my hair provides some shade, which has stopped me getting so suntanned. Steve, maybe not so much. But I'm told as well that we've got a bit of an ethereal glow around us because we're in a chamber today. We're actually in one of the test sites, one of the Element labs, instead of our normal environment.
Yeah, so we're actually recording this from one of our sites in the UK. It's one of the tens and tens of semi-anechoic chambers that we've got that we use for doing EMC and radio wireless measurements in. So yeah, a bit different. Reason is that we're having our London office extended, which is where we would normally record these videos. Right, what are we going to talk about?
Wow, how's summer been for you? Other than been busy, up to good stuff?
Yes, actually, yeah, we have been busy. I'm just trying to think how busy and why.
Yeah.
Element's just acquired another couple of companies in Korea, actually. So we've got some expansion going on in Asia. So we recently acquired a lab called NCT and then another one called CTK, both based in South Korea. And so that adds quite a lot of additional capacity for us in that region and some new capabilities, specifically, well, in addition to the sort of the wireless SAR EMC side, battery testing for sort of durability as well as fire, which is quite interesting for people that normally do their work in chambers like this. So yeah, completely different.
Cool. Yeah, and as for me, I've been doing a lot of training, planning, internal training for Element employees, but also we do bespoke training for manufacturers. So a manufacturer might contact us and say, can we have a 2-day training course on a particular topic, regulatory approvals, for example. But also, yeah, Element's own internal training plan, and always taking time like this to get us set up for being able to test and service new types of industry. Because typically the kind of compliance events that Steve and I would normally talk about, you may have noticed they tend to take place around the kind of April, May, early June, and then again in the October, November, December. So hence we don't attend so many events during the summer months, but of course we're pretty busy. But that doesn't mean nothing's been happening. Since we spoke to you last, I think we spoke to you last after the last Red Sea A meeting, and we were looking forward to an event called the Radio Expert Group. That's taken place in June 2023, since our last video. And so some interesting things came out of that. You may have heard that it definitely looks like the cyber security requirements for the Radio Equipment Directive really are now delayed 1 year. So they will come into force from the 1st of August 2025. Originally that was meant to be 2024. In our last video we were quite confident it was going to be delayed, and now we are even more confident. We're really very confident now that it is going to be delayed. So that gives the standards group time to write their standards, and manufacturers have a whole extra year to prepare for that. Other things that were discussed at the Radio Expert Group, TGN 33, radio into vehicles. Hot topic for you, Steve, I guess.
Yeah, hot topic. It's been going on for ages, actually. I think we started the work on TGN 33. TGN, by the way, Technical Guidance Note, and the Red CA produce technical guidance notes when either the standard is ambiguous or there's some interpretation that's needed. And they're really meant for industry professionals like Michael and I, notified bodies, to help interpret the regulations or the standards so there's a consistent approach. And as Michael said, the TGN 33, so the 33rd version of these different TGNs, is on radio in vehicles. And it was originally envisaged that it would be a very short thing, produce a TGN that basically said, when you put a radio into a vehicle, who is responsible and what do you need to do? Because it's a bit of an odd one that you've got the Radio Equipment Directive that applies to radios, and then you have vehicle legislation, which is essentially safety legislation that applies to the vehicle itself. And so both come from slightly different backgrounds. The vehicle directives, if you like, are what we call type approval or old approach, and then the Radio Equipment Directive being a new approach directive. So completely different standards, formation of the regulations, the law is different. So what do you do? So we originally drafted TGN 33 to provide some of that interpretation. And actually it sparked a bit of an additional debate, not necessarily within the community in terms of notified bodies and test labs, but more from a regulatory point of view. Regulatory from who actually takes responsibility for the vehicle when it's got radio in, or the radio equipment when it's in the vehicle. And yeah, it's taken a little while, but now it's being discussed at the commission level and with the ADCOs. ADCO is the, if you like, police of the different CE marking directives. And as Michael said, it got discussed in the last radio expert group. And that was partly because of the work that we'd done within the Red CA, sort of raising these issues to the Commission itself. And the Commission drafted a document which the intention is, rather than us have a TGN, it's for the guide for the radio directive to be updated. So the Commission's produced a document, and if it gets consensus between all the different member states and stakeholders, then we'll see the radio equipment guide being updated with this additional detail. And so the output from the radio expert group, so we create an input, the Commission have created their document, and it's left with the Red CA to come back and comment on the Commission document itself. So that's where we are with that. We've got a meeting coming up in a couple of weeks' time. Within the Red CA, we have a working group specifically on this topic. Hopefully we'll get to the point of getting some sort of consensus, if you like, within that group, and we'll feed that as official document back into the Red CA, and then it'll be with the Commission to update the guide, assuming they agree with our comments. In terms of the radio expert group, I'm just trying to think what else was on the agenda. One interesting topic actually is on reconfigurable radio systems, which is quite interesting. It probably needs a little bit of explanation as to what they are. So they're a type of software-defined radio, really, that you might have common hardware as a manufacturer, but because of the different regulatory or frequency allocations, if you like, within different member states, there may be some frequencies that you can't use, some channels that you can't use, different power levels from one member state to another. So the idea of reconfigurable radio services or products is that they'll use some sort of geolocation information. Maybe it's GNSS data, maybe it's an IP address, whatever means, to identify where that particular piece of wireless or radio equipment is, and then will configure itself such that it would comply with the local requirements in that particular member state or region. And the reason why these are increasingly common is because manufacturers want to produce one set of product, one set of hardware, and allow it to be used in lots of different regions. So that was debated. I think we're waiting on the output from the group itself as to what the next steps are. But certainly the idea would be that maybe there's a delegated act that will follow, or switching on some of the delegated acts that are already in the directive itself to deal with and effectively allow that type of product to hit the market.
Yeah. And that whole topic is quite interesting, and it kind of highlights one of the strange questions I guess I've received over the years, where, and I talk about the difference between the USA or FCC certification approach and the European CE marking approach, where we know that for the FCC you have to test your product and get it certified. You have to prove that it can be compliant in a certain way. Whereas with Europe, with the CE marking, it's a declaration of conformity by the manufacturer, where the manufacturer signs to say the product I sell will comply with the requirements. It's really very different approach, but typically leads to the same thing. So for example, if you've got a global hardware solution of a radio and you want to sell it into the USA, you need to prove as part of the certification that it won't transmit on a non-USA frequency band. So for example, there'll be a checklist, and a term that's often been used in the past is country codes or region codes, where you can't allow the user to go into a menu and go, I'm in the USA, so therefore I'm selecting the USA channels. The radio must prevent itself from transmitting on non-USA channels. And that's part of the certification process in the USA. In the EU, the manufacturer takes responsibility of that and they sign their DOC. And so over the past, people have said to me, oh, you're not allowed country codes in the USA, but you are in Europe because there's no rule against it. And I go, well, okay, yeah, in the USA, you're not allowed a country code if it could change the compliance of your product. But of course you can have a country code if it's just something like non-related to the radio function. And in Europe, okay, so there's nothing that strictly says you can't have a country code, but you can't sell a radio that is non-compliant. And that's something that market surveillance have been finding a lot over the last decade, really, especially with things like 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, where people will buy a product, it's CE marked, and the user has the ability to go and set non-European modes, which is obviously not okay. And so you've got this kind of allowing the user to go and configure the radio, not necessarily a software-defined radio where the user would install their own software, but more like they could just go and set it to a non-compliant mode. And interestingly, in the USA, you have the FCC rules and the testing requirements, and then the TCB takes care of the certification. And so anything that's a legal requirement but isn't really a test, like country code settings, gets caught and picked up by the TCB. In Europe, there isn't a certification process. You might use a notified body, but you don't have to, and the majority of people don't, of course. So you test at a lab, and then you sign your DOC. So there isn't really a way to catch things that aren't a testing requirement. For example, a country code selection, or the radio allowing the user to turn off DFS or turn on a higher power level. And so some of the ETSI standards have started putting clauses in going, if it's got geolocation, it must work, or if it wants to use a higher power, it must have geolocation. And it's not really a test, but it's something the manufacturer has to make sure about. So it's kind of a reminder for them. And so, yeah, so where do you put these type of things? I've kind of gone a bit off topic there from the radio expert group, but that just came to me as we were chatting.
That's fine. It actually made me start to drift off and start thinking about other stuff, actually. Yeah. And I was actually thinking about some of the other things that relate to all of that, which is things like the ETSI risk assessment guide that is in preparation. There's work going on there. I'll just spill them out and then we can talk about them if pick up on some of those. And test site equivalences as well, which is another. It's a European thing because it's driven by ETSI, but of course ETSI standards, if we're talking about wireless approvals, ETSI standards become the basis of approval or used, those standards are used in many other countries and regions around the world. So a lot of African countries, for example, use ETSI standards. A lot of Southeast Asian countries also, Australia, or Australasia, I guess, also use ETSI standards as well. So, so I mean, just picking up on that, I mean, you and I were both in a working group, ETSI RM. I can't even remember what RM stands for now.
Radio matters.
Radio matters.
I believe so.
It does matter.
It really does, yeah.
That it's like a horizontal group that deals with horizontal issues that apply to many different verticals, as in the verticals being the end market or technology focused areas. And so RM and test sites, for those involved in measurements, you're probably familiar with the fact that you can take measurements on an open area test site or in a semi-anechoic chamber such as we have here, or a fully anechoic chamber. And so different standards allow different test sites, but of course from a manufacturer's point of view, you want some confidence that you're measuring in one lab or in one type of chamber that it's going to be equivalent or yield a comparable result to another, or the limit line's adjusted such that you don't cause harmful interference. I mean, that's ultimately what the point of doing this is. So there's work being done on that, on this equivalence in terms of test sites. And then coming back to the risk assessment, you've obviously inputted a lot of work into the ETSI guide, and there's a bit of, I'm saying this without looking at the detail because of the summer holidays, about some of the additional contributions that have been made recently. I think the summary of it, as far as I can recall, was really just confirming that the manufacturer takes ultimate responsibility for the risk assessment itself. Is not the job of a third party such as us as a test lab or a notified body to take responsibility for the risk assessment, because clearly we're not the manufacturer and we have no idea the market, where the type of product is being used, and therefore really in control of all those risks itself.
I guess another thing I would add to this is the term risk assessment is a strange one, really, and you might kind of think the typical use of a risk assessment would be where you assess a place. Let's say you assess an environment, let's say you assessed a building or a building site, and then at the end of that you did a risk assessment where your risk assessment decides, is it okay for people to go and work there, or is it not okay? And so often the risk assessment is the end conclusion. You've looked at the risks and you've decided, are they okay or not? So if you look at the whole thing from a chronologic point of view, the risk assessment comes at the end and it's the final decision. Whereas when you're CE marking radio equipment, it's not like that. It's not a case of you make your product, you test your product, and then you think, oh, I forgot, I've got to write a risk assessment. I'll write a risk assessment, and based on my risk assessment, I will decide if I sell my product or not. That's kind of sounds like how it should be, but it's really not right. The risk assessment comes at the beginning and continues through, and the test results are your final conclusion. And in fact, your signing of your DOC is your final conclusion. So the chronology should be more like this. You start your risk assessment to decide, okay, is my product going to be good? Do I make my product? Can I sell it in the EU? Can I sell it the way I want? Like, I can't allow users to change the frequency, things like that. And then the risk assessment, you go, right, which standards do I apply? And how much testing do I need to do? Do I fully apply the standard? Have I used a radio module? And so can I maybe reduce my testing a little bit or whatever? And then your risk assessment, you would do your testing, and then you might look at your results, and then you do your risk assessment, and your risk assessment then is, are my results enough? And therefore the results I've got are my final step, or do I need to go and do some more testing? In which case the new testing is the final thing. But the risk assessment leads to saying, what testing must I do? What assessment must I do? And then the final assessment to the harmonized standard or to a draft standard or with a notified body certificate, whatever, that is the final presumption of conformity or the final evidence of compliance that leads you to sign your DOC. It wouldn't be so much a case of going, well, we failed, but we think it's probably going to be all right. That's not really the idea of the risk assessment. So that's one of the things we've been talking in the ETSI group at the moment.
Yeah. And we'll stay with the European theme, but just to sort of give a practical example of that risk assessment, it sort of relates to the medical world actually and wireless coexistence, but sort of to reiterate the fact that it's a live document and needs to constantly be reviewed and updated. We do wireless coexistence testing to make sure that if a medical product is used in close proximity to a radio transmitting device, that the medical device continues to work. Of course, there's always new wireless technologies, and so some of our colleagues over in the US are currently working on updating some of the tests that we do to take into account the new technology. So things like 5G, for example, if you had a medical product that's, I don't know, 5 years old, then you probably didn't do wireless coexistence to simulate your medical device being exposed or used in close proximity to a 5G device. Now they've become slightly ubiquitous and therefore it's a new hazard, and therefore the manufacturer is expected to review their risk assessment, go, oh yes, of course, 5G is a common thing now. Let me simulate a 5G signal and check my medical device is continuing to work. Wireless power transfer would be another good example of new technologies that come along.
Yeah.
So, yeah, risk assessment.
Yeah, and I guess you could say the same with a non-medical radio equipment. You know, you've assessed it, you've tested it, you CE marked it, you're selling it. Some new type of interference or risk comes along, and you do a risk assessment to decide, do my existing results still apply, or do I need to do some more results, in which case they would apply. So the risk assessment, but then it's always the final thing is the manufacturer's assessment. Yeah, interesting. But yeah, so the radio equipment expert group, I think one of the, I don't want to say exciting because it makes me look like a right geek, but probably one of the most exciting outputs that we are looking forward to is the updated RED guide. So the RED itself came out in 2016. I mean, it was written in 2014 and came into force in 2016, 7 years ago. So obviously a new RED guide. So I think topics that we hope will be addressed in there will be things like what happens when you put a radio into a vehicle, but also we're looking forward to some explanations on some of the cyber requirements. For example, connecting indirectly to the internet. What exactly does that mean? You know, it's still one of the big questions we get about cybersecurity is my product going to be in scope? Of course, we've got another 2 years until the requirement comes in. 2 years isn't that long actually in manufacturing world, and so manufacturers want to know, will my product be in scope? And so the requirement applies to products which, so Article 3.3D, for example, applies to equipment which connects directly or indirectly to the internet. And so we're still waiting for clarification on this, what is indirectly to the internet. Another question we receive a lot about is people saying, does this type of technology come in scope? So people would say to me, is Bluetooth in scope? But that's not really the kind of question you can ask. So you wouldn't say, is Bluetooth going to be in scope of Article 3.3D for cybersecurity? Because my question back would have to be, what's the Bluetooth doing? What's the product? So if I had a little MP4 music player and a speaker and they connected via Bluetooth, well, that's it. It's just streaming music one from the other. I would say probably no. It doesn't. There's no internet connection, be it direct or indirect. So that Bluetooth device, or those two Bluetooth devices, you would say probably are not included in the cybersecurity requirements. But if it was a phone, for example, or if it was a Bluetooth connection from my watch to my phone, then you'd say, well, actually, that's my personal health data, my location, being transferred over that Bluetooth signal to my phone, which is connected to the internet. And so suddenly that Bluetooth connection is. And so the question, is Bluetooth in scope, is really the wrong question. You've got to ask, is this product in scope? And that's probably the better way of putting it.
Mm. You started talking about updates because of the Radio Expert Group, and I thought it was a fantastic segue to talk about some of the emerging requirements in Europe as well. So I guess we'll move on to non-red matters, and I guess still focusing on Europe. We'll come and talk about US in a short while, but in Europe there's obviously two sets of regulations now. We have the EU requirements, and because of Brexit we then got separate GB UK requirements as well. So taking the first of those, EU requirements, emerging and updating regulations that are coming along. There are a few. One interesting one, it's just been published now, which is an updated Machinery Safety Directive, MSD, which is a CE marking requirement, or it has been since I think 2017, something like that, but there was predecessors to that prior to. Machinery Safety Directive applies to products where the hazards are predominantly mechanical, as opposed to the Low Voltage Directive where the hazards are predominantly electrical. So both are to do with, is the product safe? But one is more focused on mechanical hazards, the other is on electrical. And in fact, one of the updates in the Machinery Directive is a little bit more explanation of how those two different regulations interact with one another. For example, you could think of a washing machine, consumer product, which most other consumer products are covered under the Low Voltage Directive. Machinery Directive applies to a washing machine because its primary hazard is the rotating drum itself, and how do those two things relate to one another. So if you make a mechanical device, and the machine, by the way, I think the definition, unless it's changed, and stand corrected if it has, but the definition of machine is where you have two or more linked movable parts. So a hand saw, for example, it might have some sharp teeth on it, but requires manual input, and there's no articulation in there, and so a saw is outside the scope of the directive, but an automatic saw, like a bandsaw or something like that, clearly is a hazardous machine and covered by the scope of the directive. So if you make that type of product, watch out for the Machinery Directive. It has been updated, and therefore manufacturers, you've got a transitional period, but it is a new regulation or a new directive, and therefore you'll have to update all of your documentation and assessments accordingly. A brand new, I was going to say directive, it's not a directive, it's a regulation. And so let me just very briefly explain. A directive is a lesser requirement than a regulation. A directive is a European law that requires member states to transpose that into their own domestic national law, as opposed to a regulation which is more critical, if you like, that doesn't need translating or transposing into national law. It applies to all member states as of the detail of the regulation itself. It's just Europe-wide or EU-wide law, and is just the law. There is no additional work that's needed as opposed to the directive. So one of those new ones, in fact, it's probably the first new CE marking directive for many years, and in fact I can't think of the last one, and that covers batteries. It's the battery regulation that I'm talking about here, and of course as users we can all see more batteries being used in all sorts of products, whether they be consumer goods, energy storage systems, electric vehicles. Pretty much everything now that is mobile will contain a battery of some description. And there was a battery directive previously. It was just another European EU law but it wasn't formed or it wasn't part of CE marking. It was indirectly called up by the Low Voltage Directive. However, with the explosion of batteries, no pun intended, it's considered to be an industry in its own right, and therefore has got its own set of regulations that will now apply. They apply to durability of batteries, as well as the safety aspects of a battery. And when we talk about safety aspects of a battery, I mean, there's lots of things that you can do to a battery that can make them very hazardous. First of all, let's talk about the density of the energy. And as time goes by, the density of that energy is increasing. And you know, if something goes wrong with the battery, potentially you've got chemical issues, you've got fire and explosion issues. All of these hazards need to be addressed, and that's what the regulation does. It's doing things like heating batteries up, cooling them down, shaking them or vibration testing them. It's doing crush testing on them. It's doing abuse testing, so getting a nail and banging and puncturing the side of the battery, for example. All of these hazards are being considered and form part of the regulation, as well as the longevity or the way that you use the battery to make sure it's durable, to make sure that it's going to be fit for purpose and actually it's going to last a given period of time. So watch out for that. European Parliament has approved the text, and the next step, final step, is that it will be laid before the European Parliament for final sign-off. And then, like all of these directives, will typically have a 24-month transition period for manufacturers to make sure they comply. Of the directives, regulations, we've got the Eco Design Directive.
Been updated.
Yeah.
So this is a directive really that covers manufacturers' ability to design a product to be as environmentally friendly as possible in an energy use way. And it's so a manufacturer must make sure that their product is made in a most energy efficient way possible. And it's also linked to the energy rating labels you may have seen, where you've got like A, B, C, D, E, and there'll be an arrow to show where your product goes down. And it's a classic example really, where if you walk into a house and say, where is the energy being wasted here? Straight away you'd look at the washing machine. Or if you say, right, let's come and save a bit of money here, let's put the clothes on the line instead of in the dryer. And you don't really think about things like phones or tablets, because you think, well, they barely use any energy really. But when you think about how much time is spent on a phone or a tablet, and how many people are spending time on phones and tablets all the time, it all adds up, in the same way as if you leave a tap dripping, you will eventually flood your kitchen. Yeah. And so the Eco Design Directive is being expanded to include mobile phones and tablets. And so that will kind of come in within the next couple of years. We'll keep you up to date on that.
Yeah, Energy Star.
That's
the Californian requirement that we were thinking about before. And so, yeah, for those that are familiar with Energy Star, it's sort of related to that, really. And just pick it up on your point. I mean, there's high energy consumption devices, like you say, anything that's really got a motor in it is normally a bigger user of energy. And there's minimum efficiency requirements of motors, but typically they don't get used for long periods of time. And I'm assuming tablets and phones are now being included, because although they're relatively low, the volume of them is incredibly high. And especially if we think about, you know, certainly overnight, people plugging phones in and they're connected for long periods of time. And so really it's the volume and length of time that they're connected which probably brings them in scope. Which is
exactly. I think so. I mean, when you look at the numbers, the amount of energy used by mobile phones and tablets globally, it's huge. And you would just think, wow, how is that even possible? But exactly as you say, it's the number of devices and the amount of time. You know, somebody will spend hours on their phone, maybe tweeting about poor energy use of washing machines, and for us as a company, looking at the environmental profile of Element, which is very important to us as a company, it's very easy to walk into a lab and say, well, the shock and vibration table uses a lot of energy, but we need that vibration table to do the work. So there's nothing we can do here to turn around and walk out of the lab. And then you think, well, look at all these low energy using things that actually could be switched off. And so it's not just focusing on the big energy use things, which are not used often, but it's focusing on all those little things that are just on all the time. So yeah, interesting.
Well, talking as a person that's had a recent solar PV installation, I have the app and I have become totally obsessed with what is using energy to make sure that I continue to be off grid.
Well, as long as you're using the solar to power your phone, to be obsessed with the app to check your energy use.
Well, it's gone beyond that now because I'm making sure that I'm still energy conscious, and then I can sell the energy back and then increase the, I was going to say profitability, but the return on the investment.
They shouldn't allow engineers to have this access to this technology. They should lock us in rooms, pass work and food to us under a little slot in the bottom of the door, and we'll pass the results out. They shouldn't let us play with gadgets and toys.
There's another story about one of our colleagues that installed his own PV installation, but one for another time.
Yep.
Down the pub. Right, that's the EU requirements. Let's then keep with Europe, but go to UK GB requirements. So one of the things that has changed since we last did an update is a change in UK government position on UKCA marking.
That's correct. So you're probably aware that the UK left the European Union quite a long time ago now, 1st of January 2021, I think.
You've got a good memory.
And so then they had their own UKCA mark. And so the UKCA mark was meant to be for anything being placed on the market in the UK. Well, actually, the UK is a complicated beast, and so you've got like England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And so straight away, Northern Ireland, you can sell into Northern Ireland with a CE marked equipment. So it's wrong to say that you need the UKCA mark for the UK. In reality, Northern Ireland uses the CE mark, and Great Britain, which is England, Wales and Scotland, was intended to use the UKCA mark. So you've got the UKCA mark, which is for Great Britain. I wonder if they would have gone for the GBCA mark with hindsight, but
it's the Northern Ireland Protocol that drove the difference in Northern Ireland. Right?
Exactly, yeah. You can't have a border between Northern Ireland and the country of Ireland. And the country of Ireland is in the EU. So we were all excited for the UKCA mark from the 1st of January 2021, but then the UK's government made the decision. This isn't a trade agreement between the UK and the EU. This is literally a decision by the UK government to accept CE marking equipment into Great Britain for a 2-year period. Remember, CE marked equipment was already allowed into Northern Ireland, and so it's just the Britain part that was missing. And so the UK allowed CE marked equipment into Great Britain for a 2-year period from the 1st of January 2021 to the 1st of January 2023. They announced that, I think probably about November, December 2020, so just before that. Then, 2 years later, just before that was going to come in, they announced another 2-year extension. So from 1st January 2023 on to 2025, they would allow an extra 2 years of allowing CE marked equipment into Great Britain. Well, they've now announced actually just an indefinite allowance of CE marked equipment into Great Britain. So you can now say CE marked equipment into the UK because Northern Ireland was already allowed, and now they've added Great Britain. It's not completely simple. It's not rip up your old UKCA mark, although I do know there are some very frustrated manufacturers and approved bodies about how much money they've wasted, but there's more to it than that. It's not literally.
There is, and what I was going to say there is, if you're interested in that, tune back in, because Michael and I will do a separate video on some of the complications behind that change in the UK government position on this particular topic. Specifically, I guess, on radio equipment, and harmonised versus non-harmonised frequencies, bands, etc., etc.
Don't throw away your UKCA mark just yet.
Exactly. And then, in addition to that, we have I always get this acronym wrong, so it's the Public Security Telecommunication Infrastructure Act. That is coming in on the 29th of April.
Steve knows what it means. I know the date. Between us, invincible.
And that's a great point, actually, because I think it's like one of the best kept secrets there is.
Yeah.
And just to sort of whet your appetite, as it were, it's like is a cybersecurity requirement. It's not a CE marking or a UKCA mark requirement. It's just a piece of legislation that is coming in, covering the whole of the UK, and it comes in literally a few months. The Act has been drafted. It's been drafted for a couple of years now. It's still not finalised. It hasn't been laid before Parliament and all of the UK parliamentarians have approved it. That's still waiting to happen. But they're all adamant at the moment that this law will get passed and it will come into force from end of April next year.
Right.
And it does apply to anything that connects to the internet, and it's a cybersecurity requirement. So if that's an area that interests you, I think we'll probably do a separate little video about that, just to give you a little bit more information. But certainly it doesn't leave very much time for you as a manufacturer to do something about it to make sure you comply. So search it up if it's of relevance to you, or you think it might be of relevant to you, or contact Element, who will be able to give you some further advice and guidance.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, right, so that was Europe.
Yeah, let's fly across the Atlantic. I feel like we're taking a while. Apologise, anybody who's stuck with us. I've been quite busy. We have the FCC has their knowledge database documents, KDBs, and there's a committee, like an official committee, that works with the FCC to work on different KDBs for radio module approvals, called the Modular Committee. I'm the chair of that committee, and I work with the FCC and with ISED Canada and a few other TCBs and the TCB Council to help progress Radio Module Knowledge Database, or KDB 996369. And that's in a draft format and it's in review. There's actually a really big modular committee, but just a small number of us have been working as a real subgroup to get some comments and draft in place. And so we're at the stage now where we've submitted all of our comments to the FCC, so that's good. And so next we're kind of getting ready for the TCB Council workshop, which is at the end of October in Baltimore, USA. Please look forward to seeing you there. You can attend in person by going to Baltimore, or you can attend online. Typically we have like a beginner's day on a Monday, but all of the beginners workshop has been recorded and provided online, and so that's like a resource that you can go and watch on catch up. And so the alternative format that we've actually got this October is we've got Monday and Tuesday are completely dedicated to RF exposure, or SAR testing. I'll be talking on Monday about the Radio Equipment Directive's approach to RF exposure, and I'll be talking on Tuesday about RF exposure requirements when you put a radio module into another thing. But there'll be lots of speakers, lots of Element employees, past and present, I notice on the agenda, but other experts from the industry as well, and 2 whole days of RF exposure and SAR, and then the Wednesday will be the FCC's training, and then the Thursday will be kind of industry updates. That's where we'll hear from ISED Canada, NIST, and I'll be speaking again about European updates. That's fantastic. About that, I would say, yeah.
We have CISPRA Meetings will be in November time. They're not going to be face-to-face meetings this year. I think most of them are going to be online. And I guess really, Michael and I, we attend all of these events, or as many as them as we can. And so after those, we'll do an update of some of the important topics that have come out of that. Hopefully, we'll be able to get one out before Christmas. If not, we can't say Happy Christmas already, surely.
Kids are back to school.
This is the run-in. I always think that once the summer holidays have finished, no more bank holidays. We get lots of holidays in Europe. There are no more holidays until Thanksgiving and Christmas itself.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of the business end of the year, really.
Yeah.
It's where all the hard work gets done. So head down, go for it. See you on the other side for those industry updates. So thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.
Merry Christmas.